Good afternoon to one and all. Respected Principal Sir, Dr. Biman Hazarika, Honorable Keynote Speaker, Professor Jayato Krishna Sharma Sir, respected resource person, Dr. Anushka Singh Ma'am, dear participants and my dear friends. Myself, Mofidul Islam, convener of this national webinar on the topic Issues and Challenges of Governance in Pandemic Period, welcome you all on behalf of the Department of Political Science, Dhing College. Before starting the program, I would like to offer our heartfelt gratitude to our Honorable Keynote Speaker and the resource person who have accepted our invitation to convene this national webinar. I would also like to thank our principal sir for encouraging us to organize this webinar. I hope this webinar will be very beneficial and fruitful for all of us. So without taking more time, I would like to request our principal sir, Dr. Biman Hazarika, to give his inaugural speech and formally inaugurate the webinar. Over to principal sir. Sir,
Thank
principal
you.
sir. Okay.
Yes, I'm here. Thank you, Dr. Mofidul Islam. Good afternoon, everyone. Today, we are going to host a webinar on issues and challenges of governance in pandemic period, which is being organized by Department of Political Science of our college. Today, actually, we are hosting the second seminar. Second webinar. The first one was organized by another department, Department of Chemistry. So, it's my immense pleasure to be here as the inaugurator of this webinar being organized on a very pertinent and important topic, which is in the limelight after the outbreak of COVID-19 pandemic. First of all, I would like to welcome to this webinar Professor Jayato Krishna Sharma, currently in the Department of Political Science, Guwahati University. He is delivering his keynote address of this webinar. He is one of the prominent academicians working in the field of social science, and he has contributed immensely in this particular field of humanity. As I know, he has received different laurels in different platforms and has been awarded a Rotary Peace Fellowship and has completed Raman Postdoctoral Fellowship. So today, an eminent academician is here with us, who is going to enlighten us through this webinar. So I welcome, first of all, to Professor Sharma and our resource person who joined here from New Delhi, Ambedkar University, who is also an eminent person, Professor Dr. Anushka Singh. Welcome, Dr. Anushka. And I must congratulate my colleague who has taken pain in organizing this webinar under this COVID-19 situation. They are Dr. Lakhinanda Bordoloi, HOD Ranjit Bordoloi, convener Dr. Mofidul Islam, and convener Konkona Sharma of the host department. Several studies and exercises have indicated that COVID-19 situation has left an indelible mark in not only in health sector, not only in transport sector, not only in economy, but as well as on governance. Normal working of the legislative assemblies all through the world, almost all through the world, remain suspended since the declaration of lockdown in December 2019. And India also hit hard, as we know. It deprived the lawmakers from discharging their pivotal responsibility of questioning the government regarding their preparedness about this pandemic in various countries. Complete lockdown has hit hard and affected the basic fundamental rights of the citizens, like right to free movement. We have been deprived of right to free movement, and as well as the cross-border situation, the transportation has posed a threat. So many issues have cropped up, so many issues has affected our globe. This is unprecedented. So with this webinar, I hope and believe that our keynote speakers, Professor Sharma, our resource person, Anushka, Dr. Anushka, will shed new light on these issues which has hit hard. The functioning of governance is badly affected. Not to speak of the national government, if we discuss about the UNO and other governing government and functioning organizations, then we may see how the people were affected and how they failed to deliver good for the entire human race. So, without wasting much time, I offer this august platform from Dhing College. Just one line for my college. Dhing College is one of the pioneer higher educational institutions located in Nagaon district, and which is besides the birthplace of Mahapurush Srimanta Shankardeva. So we are always feel blessed with the blessings of our great Guru Mahapurush Srimanta Shankardeva. And this college offers three types of education. That is, three streams we are now imparting our lessons towards our undergraduate students, which is arts, science, and commerce. And apart from that, we are offering different type of UGC sponsored courses and masters in three subjects from Krishnakanto Hendik Open University. And in this forum, I would like to share an important information for which we always feel happy, that is regarding Hima Das. Hima Das already scripted a mark in the field of sports, board sports, and athletics. She has been enrolled as a student of our college. With these words, I would like to conclude my speech, and I request to carry the further proceeding of this webinar to our respected coordinator and my dear colleague. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, for your valuable speech and formal inauguration of national webinar. So now I'm going to start our first technical session, and I would like to request our keynote speaker to deliver his keynote speech. Before that, I request my colleague, Dr. Lokhinandan Bordoloi, to introduce our keynote speaker for the participants. Over to Dr. Lokhinandan Bordoloi.
Well, respected keynote speaker, Dr. Jayanto Krishna Sharma, resource person, Anushka Singh, our honorable principal sir, Biman Hazarika, my esteemed colleagues, and dear participants. Today with us as a keynote speaker, Dr. Jayanto Krishna Sharma from the Department of Political Science, Guwahati University. I am going to introduce briefly him. As you know, already our principal sir has told that he is the person who has worked in different fields. His research areas of interest are on public administration, public policy studies, Northeast studies, Panchayati Raj and development studies. He is a Rotary Peace Fellow in the Rotary International Center for Peace and Conflict Studies at Chulalongkorn University, Bangkok, Thailand, 2012, and UGC Ramon Postdoctoral Fellow in the University of Texas at Austin, USA, 2014-15. He has published many research papers in national and international journals of repute. He has also authored a number of books that include Welfare Administration in Assam, 2012, The Autonomy Paradox, Interrogation of Autonomy Movement and Autonomous Councils in Assam, 2014, and also edited a few journals. He has been undertaking different research projects and policy recommendations as well appreciated. An eminent poet, columnist, and popular speaker, Professor Sharma delivered lectures and presented papers in national and international conferences, including International Political Science Association Conference, Madrid, Spain in 2012, International Africa Conference, UT Austin, TX USA 2015, Midwest Public Affairs Conference, University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee, USA in 2015, World Conference of Association for Applied and Clinical Sociology, Colorado, USA, 2016, Rotary International Peace Assembly and Presidential Peace Conference, Atlanta, USA, 2017. His visiting fellow address at Huston Tillotson University, Texas, USA, 2017, among others. Under his able guidance, a number of research scholars have already completed doctoral degrees. He is associated with various organizations and life member of Indian Institute of Public Administration, Indian Political Science Association, Indian Academy of Social Sciences, Northeast India Political Science Association, etc. He also coordinates many national seminars and served as course coordinator of refresher courses of UGC, Human Rights Development Center under Guwahati University. So this is the brief introduction of Professor Jayanto Krishna Sharma from the Department of Political Science, Guwahati University. And now I would like to request Dr. Sharma, my friend, my class friend, although I'm taking the chance to introduce him as he was my classmate and also hostel mate. So to now over to you, Jayanto, for your deliberation. Over to you, Jayanto.
Yeah. Am I audible?
Yes, audible. You are audible.
Okay. So thank you very much. Thank you very much, Lokhinandan Bordoloi, my friend. And thank you, the authorities, organizers of this national webinar at Dhing College. I would like to address Principal, who is the inaugurator of the seminar, Dr. Biman Hazarika. His initiative is very significant from the very beginning of the initiation of the seminar. Resource person, Dr. Anushka Singh, who is present here from School of Law, Governance and Citizenship, Ambedkar University, Delhi. I'd like to thank Dr. Mofidul Islam, who is the convener of this seminar, along with the another convener, Konkona Horma. I would like to thank Dr. Lokhinandan Bordoloi and Ranjit Bordoloi, both the coordinators of the seminar. And my regards goes to all the participants who are present here in this very important, I should say, webinar on issues and challenges of governance in this pandemic period. Basically, governance is the key area to be looked into. The various ideas to be accumulated, works to be done at the local level, at the global level. So we have to look at governance issues in a very, very much comparative way, very, very much in a significant way to understand basically the pandemic crisis. If we look at this pandemic, then what we find is this COVID-19 or coronavirus actually has been wreaking havoc across the globe, including India, including Assam, including Dhing, including Guwahati. So what we find that this whole year, 2020, is very, very much a kind of crisis period, looking at the governance issues. And the whole world has not in a position, actually, such kind of pandemic had not been witnessed. The pandemic of that magnitude had not been witnessed by the world since the Spanish flu, which was occurred a century back. So throughout the 2020, what we find, governments are facing the challenge of responding effectively to an ever unfolding event with many unknowns. So a major risk here, what I find, that political and administrative leaders are associating themselves to meet physically to discuss the crisis, and a kind of policy paralysis, what we are looking at at the different levels to deal with the crisis for different regions. So actually, if we look at the crisis, then while I look at different documents, while I look at World Health Organization's report, while I'm looking at United Nations reports, Government of India's reports, Government of Assam reports, and visiting different places, even if the pandemic period has been going on, uh, uh, I'm looking at certain governance issues where I find, and studies also found, that effective communication is the key pillar of the crisis. Three important pillars I'd like to identify. One is the effective communication of the governance issues. I'll come to different other issues of governance in later part of my address. Now, how to look at that as policies are put together on the go to deal with uncertainty and ambiguity, governments have to look at the crisis while communicating with the public in real time. That is a very significant challenge of effective communication. Now, communicating under conditions of uncertainty, it's a very significant issue, that how to communicate. Maybe declaration of lockdown and withdrawing lockdown, declaration of containment zone, advising people how to face the crisis by the citizenry is a very significant process. How to face the crisis by the state departments, hospitals, whole governance mechanism is being involved in the crisis situation. That is a very important issue of sharing data by different government institutions, different departments of the governments, and at the same time between the citizen. That information, that communication must be correct one, right one, and it must help the people, help the government. That is a very significant, effective communication challenge. Now, secondly, if I look at a kind of very important governance approach, that is the whole of society approach. Whole of society approach is a very important particular approach to deal with the crisis. Now, citizens are asked here to actively take part in containment measures, including social distancing, self-quarantining, and community support for considerable yet unknown periods of time. So the whole of society approach actually is very significant approach to deal with the crisis. It's a governance approach. Now, this whole of society approach engages individuals, families, institutions, civil society, private sector, media, and various other efforts, national efforts, local efforts, to make them effective and to prevent major law and order situation, health hazards, to save the public. So it's a kind of team approach that what governance has been. I'll not elaborate more here because so many things are to be discussed. I think resource person is here later on, she will speak, and so many other issues will come up. Now, thirdly, I'm trying to focus on implementing evidence-based strategies, which is very important. Maybe strategies rooted in validated evidence, ensure the optimal use of resources, and to provide all the resources available to the people, maybe resources regarding health, resources regarding various other situations. So what we are looking at, if we look at the different ideas, different structures of governance at this situation, then what we find, how we define governance, maybe in a very simpler way, the process of decision making. It identifies a kind of process of decision making and the process by which decisions are implemented or not implemented, whatever. So how to make decisions in a very much crisis period, which has been changing continuously. If we look at the situation of March 2020, when the crisis was basically started in India, then how the decisions were taken by government of India, the Home Ministry, and again, different state governments of the country. So if we look at the division of powers here, I would also like to focus basically, I think time will not permit me, but it's necessary to focus the division of powers between the center and the states, the issue of health, how the powers are being divided, and how this pandemic situation, the Disaster Management Act, actually looked at the division of powers, and what is the federal crisis, or how the federal system has been dealing with the crisis. It's a very significant governance effort that a kind of relationship, new kind of relationship has been developed to deal with the situation in a very emergent manner. That is a very significant governance issue, what I would like to focus on in this pandemic period. Now, if we look at the issues of governance, like issue of participation, issue of rule of law, issue of transparency, responsiveness, etc., then what we find that the participation of people, already I have focused on a very important dynamic in this crisis period, which is a whole of society approach. The whole of society approach is very, very much related. I repeat, the whole of society approach is very, very much related to the issue of participation, which is very important ingredient of governance. Now, participation of people is very necessary, because without a kind of participation of people, it's not possible to deal with the pandemic like this. And participation, again, needs a kind of informed participation. It's not a kind of participation where informations are not available to the people. Participation must be informed. Participation must be empowered. So, a kind of dissemination of information to the people from the institutions, from the government is very important, from different public institutions. Information from the knowledge source of health is very important, because if we look at now, till now, people are very much aware about the pandemic, but still so many misinformations are going on in the society. Therefore, dissemination of proper information is the responsibility of governance practice. And therefore, participation of people, which is very much informed and empowered, is very important. Therefore, we are also looking at the relevance or importance of technology in this regard. Therefore, I am putting forward a kind of role of e-governance practice in the process of dealing with the governance crisis in this period. So I'll not elaborate in details about the e-governance practices, how to deal with various measures of e-governance, just I'm mentioning here only. So again, the question of or issue of transparency, responsiveness, and effectiveness, efficiency, and accountability of governance. These are very important key issues. But how these issues are working in this pandemic situation? How to look at the issue of responsiveness, where it requires that institutions and processes try to serve the stakeholders within a kind of reasonable time frame. And transparency also implies that the decision taken and their enforcement are done in a manner that follows rules and regulations. And it also identifies that the information is or must be freely available and directly accessible to those who will be affected by such decisions. And also, it's very important that their enforcement is very significant in a transparent manner. It identifies, if we look at this pandemic period, then transparency also identifies that enough information is provided, and that is that it is provided in easily understandable form through media or through different means. So if informations are provided, but these are not understandable by the public, then these are not at all actually working for the people. So transparency identifies various dynamics of governance, and which are very significant at the time of pandemic. Now, the consensus orientation, which is a very significant governance issue, is very, very much critical in pandemic period. So what I look at that the governance practice, basically the good governance practice, requires a kind of mediation of different interests in society to reach a broad consensus in society on what is in the best interest of the whole community. That best interest is to be looked into by the government, by the governance practice. So here we are trying to focus on various other issues because of paucity of time. The time what is given to me is very limited. Another important issue is effectiveness and efficiency, which is a very important governance issue. And what we are looking at, that the governance practice identifies a kind of process or processes and institutions. They must produce results that meet the needs of the society while making the best use of resources at their disposal. Now, if we look at the pandemic, then what we are looking at, the testing capability of the state has been increasing very, very much in a fast way. Now, if we compare the testing capability of India in March 2020 or April 2020 and September, October 2020, then we find a kind of difference. And also, if we look at the capability of hospitals, then also we find a huge difference. And at the same time, if we look at governance practice or governance challenges in a very, very much empirical way, in a very much critical way, then we have to look at the quality. The change of quality of the mechanism, the governance mechanism, that is very significant area to be studied. How we find a kind of difference in quality in different aspects. I'm not only providing a kind of analysis on health issues, may it be education, may it be other important areas. So under that context, if we look at the, I would like to refer the Sustainable Development Goals. To understand the challenges, to understand the issues of governance, I'm trying to focus through Sustainable Development Goals adopted by UNDP, United Nations Development Programs. We have completed Millennium Development Goals in 2015, and in 2015 itself, UNDP started Sustainable Development Goals with 17 goals to be completed by 2030. Now, if you look at the goal, which were started in 2015, please look at it. It's very significant to be looked into that these goals were started in 2015, where the whole world was not aware about the COVID-19. The COVID-19, the whole pandemic situation started only at the latter part of 2019. I'm talking about 2015. Now, if you look at what were the goals, I have already cited that 17 goals were there. Now, if you look at the first goal of UNDP under SDG is the no poverty. No poverty. That means to eradicate poverty from the globe is the basic goal. Second goal is zero hunger. Zero hunger, which is very, very much related to the issue of poverty. And what is the third goal? Third goal is good health and well-being. Good health and well-being. What is the fourth goal? Fourth goal is quality education. Fifth goal is gender equality, so on and so forth. Now, if we look at the pandemic situation and governance crisis, then what we find? We are looking at a kind of economic degeneration. I'd like to put forward some important data and very important significant analysis on the issue that how the COVID-19 is a kind of affecting the global human development index. I'll come again to SDG, but first of all, we are looking at the UNDP data, UNDP studies, and so many other international studies I'm already referring to you, that the whole world has seen many crises over the past 30 years. They say, the study says, that including the global financial crisis of 2007 to 2009, each has hit human development hard, but overall development gains occurred globally year on year. But now, COVID-19, they say, I'm quoting, that COVID-19 with its triple hit, they are talking about triple hit. Triple hit to what? Triple hit to health, number one, education, number two, and income, number three. Health, education, and income, triple hit by COVID-19 may change this trend. So crisis in income, crisis in income, crisis in health, crisis in education. Now, they're talking about how to look at this crisis. That income, the largest loss in economic activity since Great Depression. That is a very serious crisis. You are looking at how in March 2020, April 2020, the laborers, workers, they're returning from industrial places to the villages in India. The same situation was there in UK, same situation was there in different countries of the world, that the industries were closed, productions were completely stopped, and a kind of economic jobless situation of scarcity of jobs were started. So such type of economic crisis actually hit a lot to the human development process. And I have already cited that in 2015, what was the major crisis of the world? Major crisis of the world was poverty. It's not my saying, it's said by UNDP. Major crisis was hunger. Major crisis was health. These were the goals of United Nations Development Program to be completed by 2030. Now, the crisis was already there. Crisis of hunger was already there. Crisis of poverty was already there. And now the pandemic has been heated in a very, very much dangerous way to that crisis. Actually, the situation is not so good. Therefore, the governance issues are to be looked into in a very, very much categorical way to resolve the problem throughout the globe, including India. That is my basic submission to deal with. Now, if we look at the situation that their studies are talking about income, what I find that regarding health, they are talking about directly causing a death of so many hundreds of thousands of people. Look at the condition of their family. Income, loss of income. So many kinds of loss could not be, it's not possible to describe. Now, education, out of school rates, already dropout situation is very, very much problematic. Now look at how schools are being closed, educational institutions are being closed. This is the demand of the situation. Now, what will be the educational standards after the pandemic is a very, very much critical to be looked into. Now, how governance, the system of governance will deal with this crisis. I am referring only three limited crises. Crisis encompasses its boundary. Now, if we look at only these three dynamics, income, health, and education, then we have to look at the whole human development index in a different way. Therefore, they're talking about that this crisis is hitting a lot, and this triple hit on income, health, and education actually is very, very much significant to be looked into, to be dealt with in a different way by the governance structure. That is a very significant point to be looked into. Now, under this perspective, if I look at certain other dynamics, then what I find that the whole world is in a very much situation of crisis. And they say, just one Atlantic Council report says that the pandemic is not just a kind of global health crisis. It is a kind of crisis of global economy, crisis of global health. So it identifies that how and when countries and regions of the world will be able to start a real recovery is very challenging to say. It's not possible to say. So recovery is very important, but it's again very, very much. Therefore, we have to look at the whole governance crisis under this situation in a different way. And I think this seminar will focus on the issues that how the countries, how the regions will recover from this crisis. And a kind of different type of international political situation has been developing throughout the period of crisis. Now, if we look at the situation, then what I have already pointed out that some approaches are very, very much important to deal with this situation. And crisis also represents or presents some kind of opportunities for sustained innovation and learning. Now, we have to look at governance in a very different way. We have to learn from the pandemic how to deal with the crisis at the local level. Therefore, I'm trying to focus on, in case of India, a kind of development of village republic as enunciated by Gandhi, that villages everywhere of the country must look at the process of self-sufficiency, must try to find opportunities to get self-sufficiency. So dependence to others is necessary for certain things, but a kind of technique is to be developed by the villages so that a kind of self-sufficiency could be developed within a village or within some cluster of villages. Therefore, the role of Panchayati Raj administration is very significantly increasing in this situation. They must make plans in a very different way so that all the avenues which are required for the people, which are significant for the villagers, could be developed, could be incorporated in village system. That is a very significant area of Gram Swaraj, which was a kind of idea developed by Gandhi. So that idea is to be looked into in a different way, in a different approach, so that the dependency of villages could be reduced. And if dependency of villages is reduced, then automatically the dependence of a country to others will be reduced. So we have to learn. This is only one submission, but we have to look at in a very much innovative way that how to deal with the crisis, how to learn from the crisis. How successfully this crisis is managed will depend on how well each government is able to pass its hand on bring society on board while coordinating effectively with the stakeholders. Another important idea of looking at social systems in a very innovative way. So social systems by nature, they are adaptive. And this crisis presents a learning opportunity for the social systems, for the people who are involved in the social systems. So social systems must look at the crisis in a very, very much innovative way to deal with the crisis and to overcome the crisis. And after overcoming it, to start new types of technologies. I'm talking about the technologies of social engineering. We have, again, social engineering is very important to dynamic of governance practices. So new type of social engineering is to be started by the villages. by the social systems, very specifically. Not it's limited to villages, but it's encompassed to the social systems. Now, this is a test. This whole crisis period is a kind of test for our governance systems. So governance systems, the bureaucracy, must look at in a very much different way. It should not continue the old pattern of bureaucracy in the coming days. A new pattern of bureaucracy to be started. So it's a kind of test for our governance systems, and it is safe to say our collective response will shape the future for years to come. So the response must be collective. So collectively, we have to deal with the situation. I think the whole situation will be changed. Thank you very much.
Hello, sir.
Yeah, yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I'm
1 minute,
listening,
sir.
yeah.
I have some small technical problem. Sir, 1 minute, wait, please. Thanks, Tila.
Thank you so much, sir, for the informative session. COVID pandemic indeed had a very transformative impact on the ideas of democratic politics and governance, to be more precise. Allow me, sir, can I take up certain questions? Hello, sir.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, sir. I will try to club certain questions together. The first question is, how can people cooperate with government to reduce the challenges in pandemic period?
Okay. Please take all the questions together so that we may
sure.
deal. Yeah.
Sure. Okay, the first question is this. The second question is, how will COVID-19 reshape democracy and governance globally? The third question is more particularly on the role of institutions and media per se. It says, media is the fourth pillar of democracy. What is your opinion on the coverage of media on tackling pandemic periods?
Okay.
Do you think?
Can you?
That,
Yeah.
sorry.
Please. Yeah. Please continue.
Do you think that media has played a positive role in this regard? So,
Okay.
shall I continue?
Yeah. Continue.
Okay. The next question is, what are the challenges according to you state has faced to run the government in COVID period? The next question is, what are the policies taken and executed by government to recover the livelihood of BPL people? And most probably the last question, because there are a lot of questions, I've just taken 4 or 5. The last question is, how can civil society play a role to mitigate the sorrows of marginalized people? That's it.
Yeah. So actually some questions are overlapping.
Yes.
Can you cite the questions which I should answer first? Then I will continue. What was the first question? What was the first question?
The first question reads like this. How can people cooperate with government to reduce the challenges in pandemic period?
Okay. So basically, I have already highlighted one very important approach, which is called whole of the society approach, and which is very significantly look at a kind of approach where all the people, whole of the society, individuals, families, institutions, may it be religious institutions, may it be social institutions, whatever, and civil society, private sector, media, all must work together, because this is a kind of crisis where the whole society is facing problems, troubles, the crisis has not been discriminating people. Therefore, people must work together. Therefore, whole of the society approach is very important, where participation plays a very significant role. Therefore, people's participation is very important. That how people participate is a kind of condition. In other words, the people's participation will determine the success of the process of governance. That means, and at the same time, if we look at the whole situation through the lens of governance, then what we find that participation of people must be a kind of informed participation, knowledgeable participation. And again, a kind of relationship, that what you have asked in one of your questions, you have asked about the role of media, that media plays a very significant role to get real information to the people. And media plays a very significant role to educate people, to make people aware. But if media starts misinformation, then it creates problem. Therefore, a kind of positive participation from all the stakeholders, may it be media, may it be individual leaders, may it be social institutions, religious institutions, all must play in a positive way. And they must also be informed. If misinformation is developed within the media houses, if misinformations are believed by the leading individuals, then it will create problem. It will create havoc. Okay. You may ask other questions.
So the other question is on the policies taken and executed by government to recover the livelihood of the BPL people.
Okay.
And second, and the next question is almost similar. So I'd like to read the second question.
Okay,
how can civil society play a role to mitigate the sorrows of marginalized people?
Okay, BPL, these things. And please repeat, please tell another question. I may take 3 questions.
The last question is, how can civil society play a role to mitigate the sorrows of marginalized people?
Okay. So, first of all, we have to look at the triple hit to understand the marginalized people, the role of the civil society, and the measures taken by the government, measures taken by different institutions for the poverty-ridden people is very important. As I have already talked about, the poverty, hunger, these are the very significant issues of governance practice in India. So we have started so many programs and plans since our independence. If we look at the UNDP reports, then you find the South Asian region, may it be India, may it be Bangladesh, may it be Nepal, may it be Pakistan. These are very much poverty-ridden countries, may it be Afghanistan. So we find a lot of poor people here. So at the same time, poverty eradication programs are going on. And if we look at the present situation, then what we find that the loss of income, loss of jobs, and because of the lockdown, we find the crisis of the working people. Therefore, government has been taking so many measures of providing direct fund transfer to people. But in spite of that, it's very important that civil society must play a kind of role to deal with this situation. So civil society must generate a kind of awareness among people in different ways. They must help directly to the people in societal structures. In this situation, various types of psychological helps, physical help, mental help, economic help is very, very much required. And therefore, if we look at this, to come out from the crisis, to recover from the crisis, various local governance institutions, along with the civil society, along with the different leading institutions, with different social structures must come together to join hands with the people. It's not a kind of helping only. It's not a kind of providing help and coming out from the situation. No, it's a kind of joining hands together with the society. Maybe they are poor members of the society, may they be are rich. So joining hands together will enrich the situation, enrich a kind of social structure. Therefore, whole of the society approach and evidence-based strategies, which I have already mentioned, these are very significant to be looked at. And effective communication is very important. The Vartala, the communication between the people. Economic problems may be dealt with by the financial help, but more than that of economic crisis, a kind of psychological crisis has also been. If you look at so many cities, so many areas of the cities, the crisis of the jobless, they're staying in the footpath. People who were never stayed in footpath, they are now staying in footpath. If you look at different reports, the earning member of the family has been dying because of this different situation. Hospitals are not in a position to save all the people. So joining hands together, civil society may play a very significant role to create a kind of developed communication level between different stakeholders of the society. It may connect in different cases. It may connect in different cases between the people who are victims and the government organization. The civil society may take a kind of connecting role between the two levels of this poor people, the people who are victims of different health hazards, victim of income loss, victim of different types of losses, and the governance institutions of the government. Government is ready to help, but sometimes government mechanism may not reach to the people. At that situation, civil society may play a role apart from their own initiatives in different areas. And if you look at the studies, then you find how different civil societies are working together. Now, if you look at your another, okay, any other question or any supplementary?
There are
any
actually a lot
supplementary
of questions coming up, but due to paucity of time, I don't think I'll be able to take all of the questions.
Okay.
So
please ask. I should take one more question, then I'll stop.
Okay, sure, sir. So the most probably the last question. It says, "Are you?"
Well, you please ask the question which you find more important among the list of the questions.
Okay, sure. The question is, the sudden and unplanned decision of lockdown by Prime Minister took massive hit to marginalized people in India. Sir, do you agree with it? And there are other questions also. Students, basically students facing the challenges in online classes, how to overcome this?
Okay.
So basically.
Yeah, it's already we have seen, and I have also mentioned that this is a very unfortunate crisis period. And I have already mentioned that it creates a kind of depression. That's what I have already talked to you, that since the Spanish flu, the whole world was not faced such type of situation. And because of this situation, that starting from, if you look at the past 30 years, then the global financial crisis of 2007 to 2009, that the whole world was not experienced with this type of situation. And this is a kind of new experience for this generation, for all of us. Now, look at abrupt changes of decisions of the government, abrupt changes of different economic measures. The situation is actually heated the whole world. It's not only India, the whole world had faced a kind of very serious situation. Now, if we come to the very significant question that the situation of lockdown that was announced and the crisis that is being faced by the students, by the teachers, is very serious. Now, to check the COVID-19, to come out from the pandemic period, certain measures it's necessary to take certain measures. If you look at different other countries, the lockdown measures were taken. So to check the situation, certain kinds of measures are taken by the state, and certain measures are taken by the states. And all these state governments had also taken so many measures. Now, if we look at the situation, then the situation of students is very, very much critical to cope up with the internet learning, cope up with the online learning. But if we look at all the things in a positive way, then what we find that the whole system has been transforming to a new era, to a new type of understanding. It has been developing a new kind of technology in the whole society. But if we look at the situation, then in a country like India, we have always observing a kind of divide. May it be economic situation, a kind of economic divide is there. May it be digital situation, a kind of digital divide is there. There in the rural areas, maybe in urban areas, the poor families are not in a position to get the opportunities of online learning. Therefore, we have to look at these divide in a very, very much significant way. Policymakers must look at now. If policies must be made to provide certain kinds of opportunities, if this situation continues, then it is necessary to provide certain kinds of facilities to the students who are actually not in a position because of this digital divide to cope up with the process of learning. Otherwise, we may look at a kind of huge dropout situation after the pandemic. So to check that type of dropout situation or a situation of learning where learning is not being completed. Okay, they may pass their classes, but learning will be limited one. So policymakers, the educational institutions, all must look at these challenges in a very much significant way. Therefore, I'm talking about this is a learning process. The whole pandemic identifies, develops certain kinds of new innovative measures that suggest us to develop certain kinds of innovative measures, may it be within villages, that at the village level, Panchayati Raj institutions must think that who are the people who are not in a position to deal with the pandemic situation. They must make policy in a different way. Government should deal with this situation in a different way. The policies, the framework of policies must be changed. Now, at the time of making policies, at the time of framing policies, we have to look and relook all the situation in a different way. Different aspects must be highlighted and different aspects must be emphasized to give preference in the policy process. Then only it will be possible to deal with the situation in a very much proper way.
Thank you so much, sir. You have almost addressed all the questions. And it was indeed a pleasure, our pleasure to host you as the keynote speaker. Now I will straight away like to introduce my second speaker for today. She is Dr. Anushka Singh. She is an assistant professor at the School of Law, Governance and Citizenship, Ambedkar University, Delhi. By training a political scientist, she graduated from Miranda House and did her master's from Lady Shri Ram College, University of Delhi. Her MPhil dissertation is titled Constitutionalism, Democracy and Sedition in India. She was awarded a PhD degree in 2016 for her thesis, Sedition and Democracy, a comparative study of liberal democracies. Before joining Ambedkar University, she took political science at Gargi College, University of Delhi. She has previously taught at the Lady Shri Ram College and Department of Political Science, University of Delhi. Her areas of interest include nature of state, constitutionalism, law and politics, people's movement, and democratic rights, etc. She was awarded the Visiting Fellowship for Doctoral Research at Tagore Centre for Global Thought, King's College, University of London, England in 2014. She was also awarded the ICSSR Doctoral Fellowship in 2015 and ICSSR Doctoral Fellowship in 2014. She is the author of Sedition in Liberal Democracy, published by Oxford University Press in 2018. She has published in both English and Hindi in journals including Economic and Political Weekly, Social Change, Studies in Indian Politics, Pratiman, etc., and has presented at conferences both national and international. I welcome you, ma'am. Are you there?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, it's over to you for your session.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me here. I take this opportunity to thank respected Principal, Dhing College, the faculty members of Department of Political Science, and the webinar conveners. Also, it has been a privilege to hear Professor Jayanto, the keynote speaker. And in fact, while I was listening to him, I thought there are many common threads between what he just finished talking about and what I am going to now start talking. So basically, he helped me lay out the framework, and I would now get into the specifics of some of the things that he had flagged. So from what I understood and the thing that I found most interesting in his talk was the argument about political communication and how times of pandemic, crisis periods such as a health emergency, call for an innovative practice of political communication, which is a part of governance. I am going to focus on more traditional aspects of governance. And I am going to straight look at the legal framework that has been put in place by the government of India to deal with the pandemic, which is COVID-19. So one of the questions that one must ask when one is looking at the theme for today, which is issues and challenges of governance in the times of pandemic, is the question about who governs and the question about how to govern. And the answer to, I think, both of these questions for us, in a very, very conventional way is very, very clear. We are a constitutional democracy, a federal constitutional democracy, and the framework for governance has been laid down by the Constitution. So there are three institutions of constitutional governance that have been put in place, and there are very clearly marked out fields of responsibilities vis-a-vis the three constitutional institutions of governance. My focus primarily in this particular talk is going to be on these three institutions of governance and how their roles, their responsibilities, or the lack thereof has panned out in the period of crisis, which is a health crisis. Very, very different from other kinds of political crises or economic crises that we've witnessed in the past. Now, I'm sure that all of you are aware of these arguments, but just to use these arguments as a peg, I would want to go back to the Constituent Assembly debates. It's a very, very generic argument about why do we have the kind of structure that we have in terms of the relationship between the executive and the legislature. So we follow the Westminster model from Britain. And as we all know, although the Constitution talks about the government business being carried out in the name of the president, who happens to be the head of the state and the executive head, and the constitution vests all the executive power in the office of the president. um, the president has to act on the aid and advice of the council of ministers, which is headed by the prime minister. So while the real powers have been given to the prime minister, the language of the constitution does make the president the governing face of the federal republic that we are. Now, the Constituent Assembly debates give us a very, very clear picture about why this particular arrangement was resorted to. So, one of the quotes from Nehru is that the prime minister is the real leader and the real head of the state, and the president has to act according to the prime minister. These things were not written down in the constitution. They were believed to be oral conventions that were to be constitutional conventions to be followed. What was the logic behind it? We all know that even though the prime minister is also part of the executive, it's that part of the executive, the cabinet of ministers headed by the prime minister, which is responsible to the legislature, which has been given real power. The president is not in the parliament, but the rest of the executive, the cabinet, is in the parliament, which is responsible to the legislature. And this idea of a responsible government, which the Constituent Assembly tried to create through the wordings of the Constitution in distributing power between the responsible head, the responsible component of the executive, and the component of executive which is outside of the domain of parliament, is it basically lays down the principle of constitutionalism, so to speak, in our constitutional democracy. So what is constitutionalism? To put it in a very, very layperson's language, constitutionalism would mean the idea of putting limits on the exercise of arbitrary state power. So what are the ways in which the state power has been limited, the exercise of state power has been limited, and measures have been put in place to ensure that no particular institution of constitutional governance outdoes its constitutional mandate, goes beyond its constitutional mandate. So there are principles of checks and balances. The doctrine of separation of power works on this particular premise, that there are clearly divided responsibilities between the three institutions of of government. And while the legislature, which is the space of democracy, which is where the elected representatives of people sit in and deliberate on the lawmaking procedure, prepares laws, and the executive has the responsibility of executing these laws, it's the judiciary that has the responsibility of putting both the legislature and the executive in check. So the judiciary has the right to decide whether the legislature and the executive have acted in constitutional capacity or not. Now, if we try and transpose this particular framework of constitutional governance to the times of pandemic, what do we see? And do we see that the principle of separation of power, the principle of constitutionalism, the principle of keeping each institution under constant check by the other has been resorted to, adhere to, or not, is a question that I'm going to take you through in next half an hour or so. So let's move to the pandemic period and the legal juridical framework that had been, or the legal juridical architecture that had been put in place in order to deal with the pandemic. Now, we did not declare an emergency, some countries did. Could we have declared an emergency? Could we have declared an emergency on health grounds? According to the Constitution, 352, Article 352, we could not have. Because Article 352 very clearly lays down that there are three grounds of declaring a national emergency: war, external aggression, and armed rebellion. the clause of armed rebellion actually replaced the original clause of internal disturbance in 1978 with the 44th Amendment. Had we had the earlier clause of internal disturbance, probably public emergency could have fit the criteria of an internal disturbance, but armed rebellion clearly is not something that could have applied in this case. But there is, of course, the doctrine of necessity, which could have been put in place had the government wanted to declare emergency, but the emergency provisions in the Constitution did not allow the government to declare emergency. Now, just a little bit of a digression here. What had happened had we declared an emergency and then dealt with the crisis period? Now, declaring an emergency still puts in place certain kinds of checks. So once the executive decides to declare an emergency, the decision needs to be ratified by the parliament. And that kind of a measure, a check has been put in place again by the 44th Amendment to the Indian Constitution. And subsequently, the extension will also have to be sanctioned by the parliament if the emergency needs to be extended. By not declaring an emergency, and we couldn't have declared an emergency also, but by not declaring an emergency and by creating an entire space of rule by the executive or rule by the executive decree, the kind of governance framework that we adopted allowed for almost a complete bypassing of the space of representative democracy, which is the parliament. So the kind of governance that we saw in the times of crisis, which is right now, is completely an executive-led governance. It has nothing to do with the role of the parliament. The judiciary, of course, acts as a check, but whether or not it was doing that is something that we'll just come to. But the first thing that we need to understand is this, that it's something that completely avoided any kind of an interface with parliament, which is really the space, the institution of democracy where people's elected representatives sit. And these are the people who are directly responsible to the people who have elected them. So that's number one. The second thing is, what are the things that we did? If we did not declare an emergency, we did not, and we couldn't have, how did we decide to put in a framework for governance? So there are two particular laws that were resorted to. The first was the Epidemic Diseases Act, which was a colonial law passed in 1897 by a colonial regime and which has stayed in an almost unchanged manner. Is there a difficulty with the bandwidth? Am I audible?
Yes, ma'am, you are audible.
Okay.
You are audible, ma'am.
Okay. Epidemic Diseases Act, which has continued since it was passed by a colonial regime in a rather unchanged form. It continues to be a colonial law in practice. And the second particular legislation that was resorted to is the National Disaster Management Act, which was enacted in 2005. Now, I will come to, and then there were other important things that we must discuss related to how the executive orders unfolded. So things with regard to Arogya Setu app, and these are concerns that I'll come to in a bit. But largely, let's focus on these two particular laws and how have they functioned and what are the issues with their functioning. And finally, we'll come to the judicial response. Now, the Epidemic Diseases Act, like I said, is an 1897 act, and it was put in place to allow the state governments to deal with the outbreak of any particular epidemic or disease, and resort to temporary measures such as segregation or isolation or inspection in case ordinary laws were not enough to deal with the crisis. That's all. That's all that the law says. That the state governments, if they want, can resort to segregation as a policy or inspection as a policy in order to check the growth of the epidemic. What we did in 2020 is okay. Somebody needs to unmute. Yeah. So what we did in 2020 was flash the working of this particular law, Epidemic Diseases Act, and issue guidelines called the 2020 guidelines, the Epidemic Diseases Act of 1897. So we are now issuing guideline. Someone called Krishna something needs to be muted. If the organizers could do that.
Hello. Dear participants, Krishna Kosari, please unmute yourself. Please mute yourself.
That's
Hello.
Yeah, that has happened.
Kosari, please mute yourself.
Muted.
Thank you, ma'am. Continue, please.
So, so now the 2020 regulations that are being added, like the Delhi government. So Delhi government added Epidemic Diseases Act 2020 regulations. Now these regulations that are getting added to a legislation that was enacted in 1897 are not regulations or guidelines that are passed by an elected legislature. These are guidelines that the executive is issuing and affixing those guidelines with an already passed legislation. Now, that doesn't make it a law. It makes it an executive order, but it doesn't make it a law. For a law to be enacted, you have to follow due procedures of legislation. That is not happening. But just look at the kind of measures that these regulations allow the state governments to adopt. For instance, the 2020 regulation that the Delhi government passed, it allowed for history of travel to be recorded, right to impose quarantine, coercive forms of surveillance, all of these by the executive. What are the things at stake? Very clearly, the fundamental rights. Now, you're using an 1897 law. You are issuing guidelines, affixing those guidelines to a colonial law. And these guidelines have the potential, and not just have the potential, that they're doing it, of restricting fundamental rights. Now, we have all learned that fundamental rights are supreme, and the recourse of going to the court in case of violation of your fundamental right, except for protection against conviction and right to life, the recourse to go to court in case of violation of all other rights is suspended only when there is a declared emergency. At all other times, fundamental rights are supreme and they cannot be violated. If there is a legislation that calls for a certain amount of restriction on the fundamental right to be imposed, then that particular legislation needs to pass the test of the legality test, the constitutionality test. In the legal term, it would be called the proportionality test. So it needs to be specific in nature, the extent to which it will impose legislations, the proportion in which the restriction is being imposed, whether or not the purpose for which the restriction is being imposed will outdo the harm that the restriction imposes, are questions to be considered in a court of law while deciding on whether a particular law is justified in restricting the constitutional right, the fundamental rights of people of India or not. Now, in these legislative / executive pre-constitution law or new guidelines attached to these laws, these requirements are not being put to test. So if fundamental rights are being violated in the name of checking the growth of a pandemic, to what extent these are justified measures is not being deliberated anywhere. And it is an important casualty in a democracy. No executive should have that kind of power to bypass fundamental rights of people without having to prove that there is a justification behind it. We have seen the death of that process of being able to prove that there is a need for bypassing people's fundamental rights. Let's come to the DMA, the Disaster Management Act 2005. So Epidemic Diseases Act is being used by the state governments. Disaster Management Act is the larger governing scheme which has been put in place, under which the lockdown was imposed. Now, the Disaster Management Act clearly restricts the exercise of Article 19, which is your fundamental freedoms, your freedom of movement, because the Disaster Management Act says that the executive has the power to, the governing authority has the power to restrict movement, either individual movement or vehicular movement, traffic, all of these things. A lockdown was imposed under the DMA. Now, what are the issues with the use of the DMA? Number one, the DMA was not envisaged as a health emergency legislation. It's a Disaster Management Act. It was passed in 2005. It talks of natural disasters and it is applied to affected areas. So it's a pan-India law. It can be applied in anywhere in India, but it is meant to be applied to those specific areas which are affected by natural disasters. Hence, the kind of restrictions that they impose are temporary restrictions and very, very spatially located. So it's a spatial category. It's a particular space that gets affected, and the kind of restrictions that the government is allowed to impose are all to do with that particular affected space in a temporary manner. Now, public health emergency, like all of us know, is very, very different and spans out very, very differently from a natural disaster. Of course, now we've come to realize that it's here to stay, and it's not going to impose temporary restrictions on us. It's going to, in some ways, also change our fundamental lifestyle probably forever. Some of the things are going to stay with us. So Disaster Management Act is not a law that would allow for the kind of restrictions to be imposed that would pass the constitutionality test in a manner in which a health emergency legislation would probably need to. A health emergency legislation needs to think through differently on how to look at the question of people's rights. For instance, the Disaster Management Act does not talk about any kind of restriction that can be imposed on the fundamental right to life, which is Article 21. Now, we all know that the fundamental right to life, Article 21, has been expanded by the judiciary to include the right to livelihood, the right to dignity, all of these things, which means your right to livelihood, your right to dignity are part of your fundamental right to life. Now, no law has the liberty to restrict right to life, and if it has to, it will have to, like I said, pass the proportionality test. Disaster Management Act does not, of course, talk in the language of any kind of restriction to be imposed on Article 21, but just evaluate the effects of the execution of the Disaster Management Act. People's movements have been restricted, because of which people have the entire migrant crisis. People's right to livelihood has been endangered severely, and people have lost their right to livelihood, which means that their their capacity to enjoy right to life has been substantially truncated, almost marginalized to become extinct. People have lost their lives as well. Now, the mandate of the Disaster Management Act is not to be able to deal with either the extent of the restrictions that it is actually imposing, nor the repercussions of these restrictions. But unfortunately, we have continued to adopt the Disaster Management Act, almost mechanically extend it one after the other extension, without taking into account the kind of effects it is having on the capacity of the people to be able to exercise their fundamental freedoms, including their fundamental right to life and personal liberties. The other thing that we must consider, although one would say that in cases of emergency, this is bound to happen, but let's be conscious of it, is how the federal architecture of the country has largely been jeopardized. So the Disaster Management Act creates a central authority. It, of course, talks about three-tiered division of power or responsibilities of managing disaster at the level of center, state, and district. But there is one central authority that the Disaster Management Act creates, which will issue guidelines to all other subunits, which means that it's the center that takes over. Now, one would say that this happens in all crisis times, but without acknowledging that this is happening, one would not even realize the kind of temporary measures that have been put in place and where they actually become permanent. So the task to be able to show that these are only temporary measures and should not become permanent is to be able to first be conscious of the fact that these changes are happening with the democratic character of the state, with the federal character of the state, with the concept of division of power, all of these things. So that was about the DMA. The third point that I wanted to talk about is the kind of administrative responses of the state to check the growth of the pandemic, to curb the pandemic. And one of the things that I wanted to discuss was the Arogya Setu app, which had been presented as one of the most effective ways of contact tracing and hence being able to contain the virus. Now, what are the problems with this? It's important for us to not think of the concept of efficiency, the idea of effectivity, very, very instrumentally or mechanically. What is effective in a short run, or what looks effective in a short run, probably brings in the kind of long-term consequences and repercussions that we are never able to overcome from. Arogya Setu is one such administrative mechanism that has been put in place. What does it do? We all know how Arogya Setu functions and the charge that has been leveled against it. It substantially compromises people's right to privacy. Now, it would be a fair question to ask whether privacy is more important or being safe in times of pandemic is. It's a fair question to ask, and that is why, in times of crisis, it is probably allowed that fundamental rights can be restricted, because there are situations where rights need to be compromised with in order for other goods to, or other greater causes to sustain. So maybe fighting with the pandemic can be that greater cause, and privacy becomes a lesser concern. Fine, that's an argument that can be debated on. So how do we debate? Number one, we have the Aadhaar judgment, the Puttaswamy judgment. The Aadhaar judgment said that right to privacy is a fundamental right. It didn't say that fundamental right to privacy cannot be restricted. Of course, it can be restricted. But one has to meet the criteria laid down by the Supreme Court in order for the fundamental right to privacy to be restricted. Does the Arogya Setu app do that? No. What are the criteria? There are 5 criteria that the Supreme Court put in place, which would allow for restriction on right to privacy to be justified. First, it should have a legislative basis. There should be a law that should be passed by the parliament, duly enacted by the people's representatives, for it to be able to restrict the fundamental right to privacy. Arogya Setu does not even fulfill the first criteria, because the Arogya Setu app that was brought in by an executive order, there was no law that could base the execution of an app such as this. Now, not having the requirement to legislate on the issue allows the executive to do away with a lot of checks that could have been put in place to check the misuse of something called the Arogya Setu app. So if there are constitutional checks that have been put in place while collecting data, while sharing data, while tracing the contact of the people affected by pandemic, etc., maybe the abuse of the data collection process would be less or can be minimized. But in absence of any law to do that, in absence of any accountability of the government on who's collecting data, where is the data going, what is the quotient of transparency involved in the entire process, how does one trust with one's own fundamental right to privacy being compromised? Who is going to protect my sensitive information that Arogya Setu is levying from my smartphone? Think of gig workers, think of online platform workers. The percentage of inaccurate data being tabulated by Arogya Setu, the possibility of that kind of inaccurate data being tabulated by Arogya Setu is so high, because people will feed wrong information. There is nothing to check whether the information being fed by people is right or not. People can tamper with their phone systems, etc. In that case, if inaccurate data is being collected, think of the Zomato workers, think of the Swiggy workers who come to deliver food. What is going to happen to their livelihood questions? If sensitive data about their whereabouts, their personal whereabouts is disclosed, where will they find a job? Now, these are the concerns that the government has not thought of. And that's the exact question of governance that we actually at the hitting the eye in the eye in the storm. Governance is not just about the short-term challenge that one is faced with. It's about thinking of the repercussions of the short-term challenge, as well as the measures put in place to deal with the short-term challenge and the kind of impacts these measures would have. Something like Arogya Setu is dangerous any day, whether it's a pandemic time or a normal time. And for government to be able to have this kind of data, it should be accountable to people. And one of the ways in which the government, the executive, can be made accountable to people in collecting this kind of a sensitive information is by legislating on it, which is something that happened with Aadhaar. So Aadhaar eventually was passed as a law and was put to test in the Supreme Court on its constitutionality question. And then the Supreme Court also then issued certain guidelines on where are the areas where Aadhaar cannot be made compulsory in order to protect people's rights, which means that there are other institutions that have been put in place which should act as certain kind of an interface between the policies of the executive and the effects that those policies would have. What is happening in course of the pandemic period is that the rule by the executive decree that has been put in place, has been given full rein without the question of accountability being even posed. Forget about executive being made accountable. And that's a problem. Even if we have to agree that all of these measures that have been put in place are very good, even if we agree on that, there is still nothing that does away with the argument that even good measures should pass through procedural checks. There is nothing that should do away with procedural checks, not even in times of pandemic. And now finally, for the last bit, let me come to the institution of judiciary and how judiciary has acted, and whether the judiciary has been able to uphold its responsibility of keeping the executive in check or not in a crucial period like a pandemic period, especially when it's a crisis which has in a way suspended most of the rights guaranteed to people by the constitution. If not suspended technically, it has really made those conditions, brought in those conditions where the exercise of these rights has become impossible for most people, for most sections of the population. In that scenario, what should have been the responsibility of the court? The court should have taken up the question of people's rights very, very seriously in times of a pandemic. What have the courts done? Actually, on the contrary, number one, as soon as the lockdown was announced, to begin with, the courts were shut down. Shutting down of courts is the biggest kind of a damage that can happen to the rights discourse. There was one vacation bench that was sitting, but one vacation bench for the kind of legal system that we have is nothing. Courts being shut down is should be absolutely unacceptable. Slowly, the courts began to function, and they began to function through virtual hearing, which is fine. Virtual hearings can be accepted. But what were the conditions that the courts imposed on virtual hearings? We will hear cases on priority basis, which means not all kinds of cases will be heard. And what were the kinds of cases that the courts did not think were of priority? Absolutely important cases like production of the accused in front of the judge. Anybody who is detained needs to be produced in front of a judge within 24 hours. That's the first right that any person has who has been detained. You don't know whether the person has been detained legally, illegally, and it's something that only the judge can affirm through the production. The production hearings were suspended. Courts refused to hear bail hearings, saying that bail is a matter that is not to be considered important in times of pandemic. Now, this is bizarre because if you cannot allow people to apply for bail, then you shouldn't even be arresting people. But arrests continued, raids continued, searches continued. The police was working all through the pandemic. It was detaining people, it was taking people into custody, but people were not able to be produced before the magistrate, before the judge, and bail hearings were denied. Now, the two cannot go together. You can't arrest people and then say that bail is not a right to you, is not something that you can approach as a matter of right because we are dealing with times of crisis. Then don't arrest people. It should be a simple thing, because everyone who's arrested is not guilty. And even if one innocent person who's been arrested, who's not later found to be guilty, and he or she has been denied a bail hearing, it's gross injustice in the name of pandemic. Now, such kinds of injustices cannot be allowed to take place in the name of dealing with the pandemic. And the second thing that I wanted to talk about, and probably the last thing that I would talk about, is judiciary's response to the migrant crisis. Judiciary, to begin with, at least initially, completely abdicated the responsibility of engaging with the migrant crisis. So initially, when the decision of the lockdown was imposed, the judiciary could have suo motu taken cognizance of the decision. Probably it could have considered staying the decision for a bit for smooth passage to people, allowed smooth passage to people, or at least taken care of right to shelter, right to food of those people who were going to lose jobs in a massive way because of the lockdown. You see the courts being completely silent in the initial period on these questions. After the courts began to intervene, which is when the migrants started to travel in thousands and lakhs from one state to the other, and there were people on road all over. Media was covering the issue. There was a PIL filed in the Supreme Court saying that it should be the responsibility of the state to pay at least minimum wage to migrant workers because they've lost their jobs. So at least minimum wage should be paid to the workers. The Supreme Court actually responded saying that it's a matter of government policy and the state cannot intervene, which means that you're completely abdicating the responsibility of engaging with the question of whether or not people should have the right to livelihood. And in absence of right to livelihood, should the state compensate them with minimum wages or not? Now, it's a question that the court cannot say doesn't concern the judiciary. It's a question that concerns the judiciary more than any other institution. And then the courts also said something like, why do people need wages if they have been fed? So if the state is giving food to people in these centers, why should they be given wages? Now, food is not all you need. And the arrangement at these centers were also inadequate. So wages is definitely something, and it's your right if you're losing your job because of a situation which is absolutely not of your doing and out of your control. Shouldn't it be the responsibility of the institutions of the state to then ensure that you're not left to die? I mean, we claim to be a welfare state. How else would a welfare state function? If the state would say that, if the judiciary would say that, why would workers need wages if they've got food to eat? Now, these have been disappointing responses. And if we try and put the three together, first, the absence of the legislature completely from the frame of governance in the times of pandemic. Second, completely a rule by the executive without any accountability question being raised to the executive. And third, the judiciary not willing to ask questions from the executive, not being able to keep the executive in check, and abdicating the responsibility of securing people's constitutionally protected rights, then creates a framework of governance where even if we believe that everything is rosy, that we have managed the crisis very well, even if we believe that we've actually managed the crisis very well, the kind of precedent that we have set about constitutional governance should be something that we should be very, very uncomfortable with, because this is not how constitutional democracies should function. If the executive uses a pandemic period to give more power to itself, it's not how pandemics should be exploited. And which is why we had a constitution to provide the framework of governance. And those frameworks of governance must be abided by. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. So, in fact, I would say that this is a completely different take on how the COVID pandemic has been managed in this country. This is definitely an insightful lecture. Do you allow me to take up certain questions, ma'am?
Yes, please.
Okay. This is more of a clarification than a question. The participant wants to ask you about, do you think there is a tussle between the executive and the judiciary as far as management of COVID is concerned?
Can we take a few questions, collect questions?
Yeah. There is one more question, but I don't know whether it is relevant to what you just said. But since it's been asked, I will just ask you. So it says, do you suggest for any economic reformation during this long-term situation in the country? And the next question is, Union government managed pandemic of COVID-19 without health emergency. Is it healthy management of crisis? During the current pandemic, the economic downturn has greatly affected people from socio-economic stratum. How the present government can face this challenge? That's about it.
So I would like to think that there should have been a tussle between the executive and judiciary, but there isn't one. And the entire idea, and tussle is probably a wrong word, but there is definitely a balance trade-off between the executive and judiciary, where each institution tries to keep the other in check. Of course, executive can't keep the judiciary in check in very many ways, but it's the responsibility of the judiciary to keep the executive in check. So there should have been, but unfortunately, and that was the entire last part of my lecture, where the judiciary seems to be deferent to the executive, where the judiciary seems to be obeying to the executive, is willing to not even raise questions in front of the executive when it comes to guaranteeing the rights to people. About health emergency, I wanted to actually raise this particular point. One, that we don't have a legislation to deal with a health emergency. We declared it a health emergency. It's not that we didn't, but we didn't have mechanisms in place to deal with a declaration of a health emergency. And it should, more than economic reformation, of course, economic reformation in terms of how the welfare state should take care of its poor, its marginalized, but more than the economic question, the crisis period needs to make us relook at our public health architecture, which almost collapsed in the beginning. And there were measures put in place to allow the public sector to thrive, at least minimally, to be able to deal with the kind of pressure that the surge in cases would have brought to the health in the public health sector. Now, years and decades of less GDP expenditure on public health are things that we see unfolding in terms of consequences in these times, where the neglect of the public health, education and health, both sectors have been largely neglected by all governments, by successive governments. And the impact is now felt when you are faced with a challenge like this. So what the government needs to do in order to deal with, and health emergencies are here to stay, from what we see. What the government needs to do is to put in money in the health sector, build the public health sector, frame idioms in which the public and the private health sectors can collaborate on terms that the private sectors would also be willing to agree on. I mean, the COVID testing case, what should be the cap on COVID tests is one such area. And, the Supreme Court's intervention in this area, even though I'm not sure whether it was called in, but it's an important intervention, but it's an intervention that was rolled back. So initially the Supreme Court said that there should be mandatory free COVID testing, even by private health labs. And then it rolled back, saying that the caps have been put in place by the government, so we don't need to intervene. Now, maybe the Supreme Court doesn't need to intervene, but the government certainly, the executive certainly needs to intervene on these questions. So there has to be an interface between the public health and the private health sectors. And public health sector needs to be prepared to deal with not just crisis, but ordinary health hazards also, which it is not capable of at the moment. Yeah.
Okay. I can't find any more questions. Thank you so much for addressing all the questions and giving us a different perspective altogether. And it was indeed a pleasure to hear you.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Yeah, welcome. Now I would like to request, since both the technical session are over, I would like to request the head of the Department of Political Science, Dhing College, Mr. Ranjit Bordaloy, to offer the vote of thanks. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Konkona. Am I audible? Hello, am I
Yes,
audible?
sir, you are. Yes, sir, you are.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Respected distinguished keynote speaker of this webinar, Professor Dr. Jayanta Krishna Sharma, sir, Department of Political Science, Guwahati University. Respected our resource person, Dr. Anushka Singh, Madam, Assistant Professor of the School of Law, Governance and Citizenship, Ambedkar University, Delhi. Respected Principal of Dhing College, Dr. Biman Hazarika, sir. Honorable faculty members, Department of Political Science of Dhing College, all the respected participants and my dear students. On behalf of Department of Political Science, Dhing College, I take this opportunity to propose vote of thanks to all those who have directly or indirectly contributed to this national webinar on issues and challenges of governance in pandemic period, organized by Department of Political Science, Dhing College, a grand success. First of all, I would like to propose hearty vote of thanks to our keynote speaker, Dr. Jayanta Krishna Sharma, sir, gracing today's webinar. Thank you, sir, for your very interesting and thought-provoking address. I would like to thank our distinguished resource person, Dr. Anushka Singh, Madam, for making excellent expression and making this webinar interesting and meaningful one. I would like to express our profound gratitude to our principal, Dr. Biman Hazarika, sir, for his presence in this national webinar. I would like to thank our beloved Dr. Lakhinandan Bordoloi, Dr. Mofidul Islam, and Mrs. Konkona Sharma for their model support and guidance in organizing this national webinar. I'm happy to express vote of thanks to our coordinator, IQAC, Dr. Manoj Kumar Soikia, sir. I'm happy to express vote of thanks to our coordinator, IQAC, Dr. Manoj Kumar Soikia, sir, and Dr. Sanjeev Kumar Nath, sir, and technical assistant, Homendra Singh Raja, who have made this webinar grand success. I'm happy to express the vote of thanks to our beloved participants, competitors, research scholars, students, and stakeholders who actively participated, overwhelming and making the event grand success. Once again, I thank all for your cordial cooperation. Thank you. Over to Konkona.
Thank you, sir. We would like to thank you also for ably guiding us in the webinar. The feedback link has been shared in the chat box. The participants are requested to fill up the feedback form, and you will get the certificate by next week. With that note, I'd like to conclude and wind up the webinar. May good time prevail soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.